One struggling farmer's desperate fight to save his family land at a rigged county auction unexpectedly exposes a sprawling conspiracy of corrupt officials, hidden environmental records, and powerful developers, all brought crashing down when a state senator's motorcade arrives with evidence that would not only save his farm, but expose a decade of illegal land deals reaching the highest levels of government. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary story, tell us where you're watching from, and if this journey intrigues you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something truly remarkable for you. The morning dew still clung to the grass as Thomas Randall parked his rusted pickup truck at the far end of the courthouse parking lot. At 58, the weathered farmer had spent every day of his adult life working the 180 acres that his great-grandfather had purchased in 1912. Now, with foreclosure papers in his worn leather wallet and just $4,150 left in his savings account, he faced the unthinkable, watching his family's legacy sold to the highest bidder at today's county land auction. "Got the paperwork, Dad?" asked Ellie, his 29-year-old daughter, who had delayed her promising career in environmental law to help save the struggling farm. Her recent return had brought fresh ideas, but had come too late to reverse years of declining profits, medical bills from Thomas's wife's long illness, and the predatory loan that had seemed like their only option 3 years earlier. Thomas patted his chest pocket where he kept a folded document, their last desperate hope. "Right here. Judge Callahan's letter. Might not count for much, but it's all we've got." The letter, written by the recently deceased county judge Milton Callahan, acknowledged that the Randall Farm's irrigation rights had been improperly restricted during a regional water dispute in 2010. While not officially binding since the judge had died before filing a formal opinion, Thomas hoped it might at least delay today's auction long enough to explore legal alternatives. "There's Morgan Bishop," Ellie muttered, nodding toward a sleek black Tesla pulling into a reserved space near the courthouse entrance. Thomas's jaw tightened at the sight of Crescent Valley Development's CEO. The luxury resort and golf course developer had been systematically acquiring distressed agricultural properties throughout the county for the past 5 years. Local rumors suggested connections to state politicians who had mysteriously expedited zoning changes that transformed generations-old farmland into upscale resorts and vacation communities. "He won't even look at us," Thomas observed as Bishop strode into the building, surrounded by a trio of assistants in expensive suits. "Man's bought half the county and doesn't have the decency to acknowledge the families he's displacing." Inside the courthouse, the auction registration desk was already surrounded by potential bidders, mostly representatives from investment groups and development companies. Thomas and Ellie joined the line, painfully aware that they had no realistic chance of outbidding the corporate interests. Their presence was symbolic at best, a final stand before surrendering their heritage. "Name?" asked the clerk, without looking, up from her computer. "Thomas Randall. I'm here about Lot 37, the Randall property on County Road 218. The clerk frowned, checking her screen. "I'm sorry, Mr. Randall, but you're not eligible to participate in today's auction." "What?" "That's my family's farm being sold. I have a right to be here. According to my records, parties with direct interest in foreclosed properties are observers only, not eligible bidders." She slid a visitor badge across the counter. "You can watch from the designated seating area, but you cannot register to bid." Thomas felt the blood rush to his face. "That's not right. There's no such restriction in county auction rules." "It's a new policy," the clerk replied without emotion. "Implemented last month by the county commissioner's office. I'm just following the guidelines I've been given." Ellie stepped forward, her legal training evident in her precise tone. "We'd like to see documentation of this policy change, please. As a matter of public record." The clerk's composure faltered momentarily. "You'd need to file a formal request with the Commissioner's office. I don't have those documents here." As they moved away from the registration desk, Ellie whispered, "That's completely illegal. They can't block affected property owners from participating in public auctions without published notice and review." Thomas nodded grimly. "Doesn't matter. If it's illegal, if there's no one to stop them, this whole auction could be over in an hour." They made their way to the auction room, where Thomas immediately noticed several unfamiliar faces, men in dark suits positioned near the exits, communicating via discreet earpieces. They seemed out of place among the local developers and county officials, their watchful demeanor suggesting something beyond routine security. Taking seats in the back row, Thomas and Ellie reviewed their limited options. Judge Callahan's letter acknowledged the improper restriction of their water rights, but without official filing, it carried little legal weight. Their attorney had filed for an emergency injunction, but the hearing wasn't scheduled until next week, far too late to stop today's proceedings. "I still don't understand why they're rushing this auction," Ellie murmured, examining the auction lot list. "Our property isn't even the most valuable on the block, but they scheduled it first." Thomas had wondered the same thing. Their farm, while sizable, was less desirable than several others being auctioned today. Yet somehow, Randall Farms had been prioritized for immediate sale, with the auction's start time even moved up by 2 hours from the originally published schedule. As the room filled, Thomas noticed Morgan Bishop engaged in intense conversation with County Commissioner William Hayes in a corner. The two men kept glancing toward the Randalls, their expressions suggesting irritation at their presence. "Something's not right," Thomas whispered. "Bishop looks nervous, not confident. And why would the commissioner himself be here for a routine land auction?" Ellie was about to respond when her phone buzzed with a text message. Her eyes widened as she read it. "Dad, that was Maria from Judge Callahan's office. She says we need to check the property survey immediately. There's something about our land that wasn't in the letter. Now the auction starts in 20 minutes. She says it's crucial, something the judge discovered just before he died. She's sending a file to my email now." As Ellie accessed her email on her phone, Thomas noticed increased activity near the entrance. The security personnel had suddenly become more alert, positioning themselves strategically around the room. "Dad, look at this," Ellie whispered, showing him her phone screen. It displayed a detailed map of their property, with a section along the northern boundary highlighted in red. Accompanying notes in Judge Callahan's handwriting referenced "protected," "wetlands," and 1997 environmental survey deliberately suppressed. "I don't understand," Thomas said, squinting at the small screen. "That section is just scrubland. We've never been able to farm it." According to this, it's a protected watershed connected to the state river basin. If this is accurate, our property contains protected wetlands that were never properly documented. Ellie's voice rose with excitement. "This could change everything. Protected land can't be developed or rezoned, which would explain why they're in such a hurry to push this sale through before anyone realizes." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the auctioneer at the podium. As he prepared to begin the proceedings, a commotion at the main entrance drew everyone's attention. A court clerk hurried in, whispering urgently to Commissioner Hayes. His face paled visibly as he received the message, then he quickly approached the auctioneer, signaling for a delay. Through the open doors, Thomas could see increased activity in the courthouse hallway. More security personnel appearing, courthouse staff moving with sudden urgency, and the distinctive black SUVs of an official motorcade pulling up outside. "What in the world?" Thomas murmured, rising slightly to get a better view. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, there will be a brief delay to the start of today's proceedings. Please remain seated." Commissioner Hayes approached Morgan Bishop, engaging in what appeared to be a heated, whispered exchange. Bishop's confident demeanor had vanished, replaced by visible anxiety as he repeatedly glanced toward the doors. Minutes later, the atmosphere in the room transformed as State Senator Eleanor Morrison entered, accompanied by staffers and what appeared to be representatives from the State Environmental Protection Division. Her presence, unusual for a routine county land auction, caused immediate murmurs throughout the audience. More shocking was who accompanied her, Judge Milton Callahan's widow, Patricia, clutching a leather portfolio stamped with the county in court seal. The senator approached the auctioneer's podium, her expression grave but determined. "Good morning. I apologize for interrupting, but I'm requesting an immediate suspension of today's proceedings pending an emergency injunction from the State Attorney General's office." Commissioner Hayes stepped forward, his forced smile failing to mask his discomfort. "Senator Morrison, this is highly irregular. The county has followed all proper procedures for this auction." "That, Commissioner, is precisely what we're here to investigate," Senator Morrison replied, her voice carrying throughout the now silent room. "It has come to our attention that certain properties scheduled for auction today, beginning with the Randall farm, contain environmentally protected lands that were deliberately misclassified in county records." She gestured to Patricia Callahan, who stepped forward with dignity despite her recent widowhood. "Mrs. Callahan has provided my office with documents from Judge Callahan's private files he was reviewing before his unexpected death 3 weeks ago. These documents suggest a systematic effort to conceal environmental survey data that would prevent development on these properties." Thomas and Ellie exchanged shocked glances as the implications became clear. Judge Callahan's letter about water rights had only been the tip of a much larger issue, one that potentially explained why the elderly judge had died so suddenly after beginning to investigate county land records. As Senator Morrison continued addressing the stunned audience, a courthouse security officer approached the Randalls. "Mr. Randall, Senator Morrison would like to speak with you and your daughter privately before proceeding further." Thomas nodded, his mind racing to process this sudden turn of events. What had begun as a last, desperate attempt to delay the loss of his family farm had somehow connected to something much larger, a discovery that had caught the attention of state officials and sent powerful developers into visible panic. And somehow, their modest family farm stood at the center of it all. What Thomas Randall couldn't possibly know as he and Ellie followed the security officer toward a private conference room, where Senator Morrison waited with environmental officials and state law enforcement representatives, was that the tattered map in Judge Callahan's files would lead to the unraveling of a decade-long conspiracy involving land misclassification, environmental regulation evasion, and corruption that reached into the highest levels of county government. The humble farmer who had arrived that morning prepared to lose everything was about to become the key figure in exposing a scandal that would transform the future of the entire region, and in the process reveal the true value of the land his family had stewarded for 4 generations. A value that had nothing to do with development potential and everything to do with environmental legacy. The auction room fell silent as State Senator Eleanor Morrison strode purposefully to the front, her presence commanding immediate attention. At 63, the veteran legislator had built her reputation on fighting corruption and environmental protection, qualities that had made her both respected and feared throughout the state. "Good morning," she began, her voice measured but firm. "I apologize for this interruption, but I've come directly from the state capitol with matters of urgent public interest regarding today's proceedings." Commissioner Hayes stepped forward, a forced smile barely masking his discomfort. "Senator Morrison, while we're honored by your presence, this is a standard county foreclosure auction operating under established protocols. Perhaps we could discuss any concerns after— That won't be possible, Commissioner, the senator interrupted, her tone leaving no room for debate. My office has received credible evidence of significant irregularities in the classification and auction process for several properties listed today, particularly the Randall Farm scheduled as Lot 37. Thomas and Ellie exchanged stunned glances. How had a state senator become involved in their situation? And what connection did she have to Judge Callahan's widow, who stood solemnly beside her? The senator continued, addressing the room at large. Patricia Callahan has brought to my attention documents discovered among her late husband's effects, documents he was reviewing before his unexpected death 3 weeks ago. These papers suggest deliberate misclassification of certain land parcels to circumvent environmental protection regulations. Morgan Bishop rose from his seat, his composure noticeably strained. Senator, with all due respect, these are serious allegations that should be properly investigated through appropriate channels, not aired in a public auction. If Mrs. Callahan has concerns, there are formal procedures, such as the investigation Judge Callahan had initiated before his untimely death. Patricia Callahan spoke for the first time, her voice soft but steady. My husband served this county for 27 years. In his final days, he discovered irregularities in how certain properties had been classified for development. He was preparing to issue injunctions before he died. The tension in the room was palpable as Patricia opened the leather portfolio she carried. This contains the original 1997 environmental survey of the northern watershed that crosses multiple properties scheduled for auction today, including the Randall Farm. This survey was deliberately omitted from county records when development plans were submitted 5 years ago. Commissioner Hayes's face had grown increasingly pale. These are unfounded accusations that have no bearing on today's legal proceedings. The auction will continue as scheduled. He nodded to the auctioneer, who hesitantly moved toward the podium. Senator Morrison held up her hand. Commissioner, I have here an emergency injunction signed by Judge Raymond Carlton of the State Circuit Court, temporarily halting all auctions pending investigation of these documents. She handed the official paper to a court officer. Additionally, representatives from the State Environmental Protection Division will be conducting immediate surveys of the properties in question. The room erupted in murmurs and exclamations as Morgan Bishop conferred urgently with his associates. Several bidders began gathering their materials and departing, clearly wanting no association with what was rapidly becoming a public scandal. Ellie leaned toward her father, her voice barely containing her excitement. Dad, do you realize what this means? If our land includes protected wetlands that were deliberately misclassified, the entire foreclosure could be invalidated. Thomas nodded slowly, struggling to process this sudden reversal of fortune. For weeks, he had resigned himself to losing everything. Now, a glimmer of hope had appeared from the most unexpected source, the meticulous notes of a recently deceased judge. A court officer approached their row. Mr. Randall, Senator Morrison and Mrs. Callahan would like to speak with you privately. If you'd follow me to Conference Room B. The small conference room off the main courthouse corridor already contained several people when Thomas and Ellie entered. Senator Morrison, Patricia Callahan, and 2 individuals introduced as investigators. From the State Environmental Protection Division. Mr. Randall, Senator Morrison began once introductions were complete. I apologize for the dramatic nature of our intervention, but time was of the essence. 3 days ago, Mrs. Callahan contacted my office with documents that suggest a systematic effort to reclassify protected wetlands throughout Westridge County, particularly on properties targeted for resort development. Milton was troubled for weeks before he died, Patricia explained. her grief still evident beneath her dignified exterior. He couldn't sleep, spent hours reviewing old land surveys and county records. The night before his heart attack, he told me he'd discovered something that would stop Hayes and his developer friends in their tracks. She carefully removed several documents from her portfolio, spreading them across the conference table. After the funeral, I found these in his home office. Copies of environmental surveys from 1997 that established a protected watershed spanning several properties, including your northern acreage. Thomas leaned forward, examining a faded map, with areas outlined in blue. That's the scrubland section we could never properly farm, always too wet, even in drought years. My grandfather called it the marsh. For good reason, explained Dr. Rebecca Chen, the lead environmental investigator. According to these original surveys, that section is part of the Silver Creek watershed that feeds the state river basin. It was designated as a protected wetland habitat under both state and federal guidelines. But when we tried to get agricultural subsidies for maintaining wetlands 10 years ago, we were told our property didn't qualify, Thomas said, confusion evident in his voice. Senator Morrison nodded grimly. That's the heart of this matter. Somehow, the official county records were altered to reclassify these wetlands as standard agricultural land. This happened approximately 5 years ago, coinciding with the first purchases by Crescent Valley Development. The pattern is clear, added James Wilson, the second environmental investigator. Every property purchased for resort development in the past 5 years had portions of protected wetlands that mysteriously disappeared from official records. Without those protections, the land could be drained, filled, and built upon, despite critical environmental consequences downstream. Ellie's legal training immediately recognized the implications. If the wetlands were illegally declassified, then any development permits would be invalid. And if the foreclosure on our farm was accelerated to facilitate development that couldn't legally occur, exactly, Senator Morrison confirmed. We have reason to believe Commissioner Hayes and certain county officials received substantial compensation for facilitating these classification changes. Judge Callahan had begun connecting these dots before his death. Thomas sat back, overwhelmed by these revelations. Are you saying my farm was targeted specifically because of these wetlands? Patricia Callahan nodded solemnly. Milton believed so. The patterns of property acquisition, foreclosure acceleration, and record modification all point to a coordinated effort. Your farm was particularly valuable because it contains the largest single section of the protected watershed. What happens now? Thomas asked, his farmer's pragmatism reasserting itself amid the shock. Immediate suspension of all foreclosure proceedings on the affected properties, Senator Morrison explained. A comprehensive environmental reassessment of the watershed, and a full investigation into the records manipulation, which will likely lead to criminal charges against those involved. And our farm, Ellie pressed, if everything checks out as we believe it will, your foreclosure will be invalidated due to fraudulent classification and procedural misconduct, Senator Morrison replied. Moreover, with proper recognition of the wetland status, your property would qualify for significant conservation easement payments, compensation for maintaining protected environmental assets. As they discussed next steps, a commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Through the conference room's glass panel, they could see Commissioner Hayes being escorted from the building by state police officers, his face ashen. Nearby, Morgan Bishop was engaged in intense conversation with what appeared to be his attorneys, gesturing frantically toward documents being presented by environmental officials. Things are moving quickly, Senator Morrison observed. The state Attorney General's office has initiated a priority investigation based on the evidence Mrs. Callahan provided. Several county officials have already agreed to cooperate in exchange for consideration, Thomas turned to Patricia Callahan, emotion tightening his voice. "I don't know how to thank you. If Judge Callahan hadn't discovered this, Milton believed in doing what was right, even when it wasn't convenient." Patricia replied simply, "He would be pleased to know his final investigation may save your family farm." As they prepared to leave the conference room, Thomas was startled to see a familiar face at the courthouse entrance: Robert Mitchell, president of First Regional Bank, which held his mortgage. The banker was deep in conversation with one of Senator Morrison's aides, constantly checking his phone while nodding vigorously. "Looks like your lender is getting nervous," Senator Morrison noted with a slight smile. Amazing how quickly financial institutions reconsider their positions when fraud investigations begin. By late afternoon, the implications of the morning's events had spread throughout the county. Local news crews had gathered outside the courthouse, reporting on what they described as potentially the largest land fraud scheme in state history. Thomas and Ellie watched the coverage from Senator Morrison's temporary office, still processing the dramatic reversal of their fortunes. The State Environmental Protection Division has confirmed initial findings supporting allegations that protected wetlands were deliberately misclassified to facilitate development, announced a television reporter standing outside the courthouse. Sources close to the investigation suggest this scheme may have affected dozens of properties and involved millions in fraudulent transactions. As Thomas watched the report, his phone rang, the third call that hour from neighbors facing similar foreclosure situations. Word had spread quickly that Thomas Randall, the farmer who had arrived that morning expecting to lose everything, was now at the center of a case that might save not just his land, but numerous other family farms throughout the county. What Thomas couldn't possibly know, as he fielded questions from increasingly respectful bank representatives and scheduled meetings with environmental officials, was that the modest scrubland on his property, the section he'd never been able to farm successfully, would soon be recognized as one of the most ecologically significant wetland habitats in the region. Nor could he anticipate how Judge Callahan's final act of justice would transform not just the Randall Farm's future, but the environmental and economic direction of the entire county. The humble farmer, who had been deliberately blocked from bidding on his own property, had unwittingly become the catalyst for exposing corruption that reached into the highest levels of county government, all because a state senator's motorcade had arrived with evidence that halted not just an auction, but an entire criminal enterprise built on environmental fraud. 3 days after the dramatic halt of the county auction, Thomas Randall stood at the edge of his northern property line, watching as a team of state environmental scientists collected soil samples and catalogued plant species. The area he had always considered troublesome scrubland was now the focus of intense scientific interest, with experts identifying rare wetland flora and documenting evidence of protected wildlife habitats. "Your grandfather was right to call this the marsh," Dr. Chen explained, pointing to distinctive vegetation patterns. "This is a textbook example of a transitional wetland ecosystem. The soil composition shows it's been undisturbed for generations, which makes it exceptionally valuable from a conservation perspective." Thomas nodded, still adjusting to the idea that the least productive section of his farm might be its most valuable asset. "All these years, I thought this land was a burden. Couldn't grow crops here, couldn't graze livestock effectively. That unintentional preservation is precisely what makes it so significant," Dr. Chen replied. "Most similar wetlands have been drained or developed. This intact ecosystem provides critical habitat for several threatened species and plays a key role in filtering groundwater for the entire watershed." Ellie joined them, carrying a folder of documents she'd been reviewing with Senator Morrison's legal team. The preliminary findings are even more significant than we thought, Dad. The environmental assessment indicates our wetland section connects to similar areas on 5 neighboring properties, all of which were targeted for acquisition by Crescent Valley Development. The pattern is unmistakable, added James Wilson, who had been comparing historical surveys with current satellite imagery. When mapped together, these properties form a continuous ecosystem that regulates water flow throughout the county. Developing this area would have caused catastrophic environmental damage downstream, including potential flooding in several communities. Thomas frowned, his practical nature struggling with a troubling question. But why would Bishop and his developers take such a risk? Surely they must have realized the environmental violations would eventually be discovered. That's where things get even more disturbing, Ellie replied, her expression grim. Senator Morrison received preliminary findings from the Attorney General's investigation this morning. It appears Commissioner Hayes had arranged for permanent suppression of the original environmental surveys. They were removed from both digital records and physical archives. If Judge Callahan hadn't maintained his own copies of county documentation, this entire scheme might have succeeded, Wilson added. With the original surveys erased and new fraudulent assessments inserted into the record, there would have been no official basis to challenge the development plans. As they spoke, a black SUV with state government plates approached along the farm's access road. Senator Morrison emerged, accompanied by a man Thomas didn't recognize, distinguished-looking with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Mr. Randall," the senator called, waving him over, "there have been significant developments. This is Howard Brennan, the state attorney general. He wanted to brief you personally on the investigation's progress." The attorney general shook Thomas's hand firmly. "Mr. Randall, your property has become the centerpiece of what we now recognize as an environmental fraud conspiracy of unprecedented scale. What began as an investigation into record falsification has expanded to include money laundering, bribery of public officials, and potentially even more serious criminal activity. They gathered under the shade of an old oak tree near the property boundary, where Brennan spread several documents on the hood of his vehicle. Based on financial records seized during yesterday's searches, we've discovered that Crescent Valley Development isn't simply a resort developer, Brennan explained. It appears to be a shell corporation backed by Meridian Global Investments, a foreign-owned conglomerate with a troubling history of environmental exploitation and water rights manipulation worldwide. Meridian has a documented pattern, Senator Morrison added. They acquire properties with critical water resources, develop luxury resorts as a cover, then effectively privatize water access for surrounding communities. They've done this in drought-prone regions across 3 continents. Thomas struggled to process this information. "You're saying they wanted our farms not for resorts, but for water control?" "Precisely," Brennan confirmed. "The wetlands on your property and neighboring farms form the headwaters of the regional watershed. By controlling these properties, Meridian would effectively gain leverage over water resources for the entire county, including the municipal supply for Westridge City and 6 smaller communities." Ellie's environmental law background allowed her to immediately grasp the implications. During drought conditions, they could potentially dictate water pricing and allocation to entire communities. With climate change increasing drought frequency, water rights are becoming more valuable than the land itself. That explains the urgency in pushing through these foreclosures, Thomas realized. The development plans were just a smokescreen for a water rights grab. As they discussed these revelations, Thomas noticed increased activity along the main road, several news vans setting up equipment and reporters preparing for broadcasts. The story was clearly gaining national attention. Beyond local coverage, "There's something else you should know," Senator Morrison said, her tone becoming more somber. "The medical examiner has reopened the investigation into Judge Callahan's death. Given the timing of his discovery and the significance of what he uncovered, there are concerns about the circumstances." "You think he was—" Thomas couldn't bring himself to finish the question. "At this point, we're simply being thorough," Brennan interjected diplomatically. "Judge Callahan had a documented heart condition, but the convergence of his death with his investigation into these records is troubling." Patricia Callahan mentioned he had received several anonymous threats in the weeks before his passing. This disturbing possibility cast the entire situation in an even darker light. If those behind the conspiracy were willing to go to such lengths, the stakes were clearly higher than Thomas had imagined. "What happens now?" Thomas asked, his farmer's pragmatism once again asserting itself amid the shocking revelations. "For your property specifically, good news," Senator Morrison replied. "The emergency injunction has been extended indefinitely, and the State Environmental Trust has expressed interest in establishing a conservation easement for the wetland portion, which would provide annual payments for maintaining it as protected habitat. Those payments would more than offset your mortgage obligations. Additionally," Brennan added, "as victims of documented fraud, affected landowners like yourself will have grounds for civil recovery against both the county and the development. Companies involved, the restitution could be substantial." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. The financial crisis that had threatened to end his family's farming legacy had unexpectedly transformed into an opportunity to secure that legacy for generations to come. "And the others involved?" Ellie asked. "Commissioner Hayes and Bishop?" "Hayes is cooperating with investigators in exchange for consideration," Brennan explained. "He's provided detailed information about the bribery scheme and document falsification. Bishop attempted to leave the country yesterday, but was detained at the airport. We've frozen all assets associated with Crescent Valley development pending further investigation." As they concluded their discussion, Dr. Chen approached with excitement. "Mr. Randall, we've just identified a nesting pair of silver-crested herons in your wetland section, a species listed as vulnerable and rarely documented in this region. This finding alone would qualify your property for priority conservation status." The irony wasn't lost on Thomas. For years, he had viewed the troublesome marsh as a liability, land that couldn't be properly farmed and contributed nothing to the family's finances. Now that same land had not only saved his farm from foreclosure, but positioned it to become financially sustainable through conservation rather than traditional agriculture. By evening, the story had reached national news networks. Thomas watched, with a mixture of awe and discomfort, as reporters described the brave family farmer who unwittingly exposed a multinational conspiracy to control regional water resources. His simple fight to save his land had expanded into something far beyond anything he could have imagined that morning at the courthouse. As Thomas and Ellie sat on their farmhouse porch watching the sunset, they were joined by Patricia Callahan, who had come to share additional documents she had discovered among her late husband's effects. "Milton kept detailed notes of every inconsistency he found," she explained, passing a leather-bound journal to Thomas. "He was particularly concerned about your property because it contained the largest continuous section of the wetland ecosystem. He called it the keystone of the watershed." Thomas carefully opened the journal, finding meticulous documentation of altered records, suspicious timing of zoning changes, and unusual financial transactions involving county officials. Judge Callahan had been building a comprehensive case before his death, a case that might have remained undiscovered if Thomas hadn't brought the judge's letter to the auction that morning. He would be pleased to know his work wasn't in vain, Patricia said softly, gazing out over the farm that her husband had fought to protect even after his death. What Thomas Randall couldn't know as he reviewed the late judge's careful documentation was that the fight was far from over. The powerful interests behind Meridian Global Investments wouldn't abandon their water acquisition strategy easily, and the exposure of their methods in Westridge County was merely the first skirmish in what would become a much larger battle, one that would eventually reveal similar conspiracies in drought-vulnerable regions across the country. The humble farmer who had been blocked from bidding on his own land had unwittingly become the central figure in exposing a nationwide strategy of environmental exploitation and resource control, a revelation that would ultimately change how Americans viewed the increasing corporate acquisition of agricultural land and the precious water rights that came with it. 2 weeks after the halted auction, Thomas Randall found himself in an unfamiliar position, sitting before a congressional subcommittee on environmental resources and rural affairs in Washington, D.C. The family farmer who had rarely traveled beyond state lines was now testimony to provide insight into what officials were calling a systematic attempt to monopolize critical water resources through predatory acquisition of agricultural lands. "Mr. Randall," began Congresswoman Diana Hawkins, the subcommittee chair, "would you please describe for the record how you first became aware of the environmental significance of your property?" Thomas leaned toward the microphone, his weathered hands clasped before him. "It was pure chance, ma'am. If Judge Callahan hadn't left that letter, and if his clerk hadn't sent us the property survey right before the auction, my farm would have been sold and bulldozed by now. We had no idea our troublesome marsh was actually protected wetland. And to clarify," Congresswoman Hawkins continued, "prior to these events, had any county or state officials ever informed you about the environmental protections that should have applied to your property?" "No, ma'am. Quite the opposite. When we applied for wetland conservation programs years ago, we were specifically told our property didn't qualify. We now know those applications were deliberately misdirected by county officials working with the developers." The hearing room was packed with journalists, environmental advocates, and representatives from agricultural communities across the country. What had begun as a local land dispute had expanded into a national investigation, as similar patterns of wetland misclassification and targeted foreclosures emerged in drought-vulnerable regions throughout the western and southern states. Ellie sat beside her father, having been invited to provide her legal perspective on the environmental aspects of the case. On Thomas's other side sat Patricia Callahan, whose late husband's meticulous documentation had become central to the widening investigation. "Mrs. Callahan," the Congresswoman continued, "based on your late husband's records, how extensive was this record falsification in Westridge County?" Patricia opened the leather portfolio that had become a familiar sight at these proceedings. Judge Callahan documented alterations to environmental surveys affecting 27 properties over a 5-year period. In each case, protected wetland designations were removed from official records, and the timing aligned precisely with acquisition attempts by shell companies we now know were controlled by Meridian Global Investments. As Patricia spoke, large screens displayed maps showing the affected properties, which together formed a comprehensive network of water resources throughout the county. When combined with similar maps from other counties, a disturbing pattern emerged: systematic targeting of watershed headwaters in regions projected to face increasing water scarcity due to climate change. "The investigation has expanded significantly," Brennan explained, spreading documents across the coffee table in their suite. "We've identified financial connections between Meridian Global and at least 4 major banks that accelerated agricultural foreclosures in targeted watershed regions. The pattern is consistent: acquire land, secure water rights, then leverage those rights for profit during scarcity." "What's truly disturbing," added Senator Morrison, "is how close they came to succeeding. If Judge Callahan hadn't preserved Those original environmental surveys. And if you hadn't brought his letter to that auction, Meridian would now control the primary water sources for an entire county. Patricia Callahan touched a framed photo of her late husband she had brought with her to Washington. Milton always said that justice depends on ordinary people doing the right thing when it matters most. He would be proud to see how his final case has expanded to protect so many. Thomas nodded thoughtfully, his mind returning to the farm, waiting for him back home. The congressional testimony and national attention were important, but his true concern remained the land his family had stewarded for generations, land that had nearly been lost to forces he hadn't even understood 2 weeks earlier. "What happens when we go home?" he asked practically. Meridian and companies like them aren't going to simply abandon their strategy because we've exposed one operation. "You're absolutely right," Brennan acknowledged, "which is why we're establishing a joint task force focused on water resource protection, with particular attention to agricultural regions facing similar pressures. We'd like you and Ellie to serve as civilian advisors, providing the perspective of affected landowners." Ellie looked at her father with excitement. "Dad, this is an opportunity to ensure what almost happened to us doesn't happen to others. My environmental law background combined with your practical farming experience, we could really contribute something meaningful." Thomas considered the proposal carefully. His lifelong focus had been tending his own land, not engaging with national policy. Yet the past 2 weeks had revealed how vulnerable individual farmers were to these larger forces, and how important it was to have rural voices involved in crafting protections. "I'm a farmer, not a politician or legal expert," he said finally. "But if our experience can help protect other family farms and the water resources we all depend on, then I'm willing to do my part." What Thomas Randall couldn't know as he agreed to this new role was that the battle over water rights was just beginning. The multinational interests behind Meridian Global represented merely one approach to a strategy being implemented through various means across the country, a long-term effort to control increasingly scarce resources that would define environmental and agricultural conflicts for decades to come. The humble farmer, who had been blocked from bidding on his own land, had inadvertently become not just a witness in a congressional investigation, but the public face of a growing movement to protect rural water resources from exploitation. His straightforward integrity and practical wisdom would bring an essential perspective to debates typically dominated by corporate interests and urban policymakers, ensuring that the voices of agricultural communities remained central to decisions affecting their future. 6 months after the dramatic courthouse confrontation, Thomas Randall stood in the northern section of his farm, the wetland area now officially designated as the Callahan Conservation Preserve. Metal markers defined the boundaries of the protected habitat, while a small observation platform allowed environmental researchers to monitor the thriving ecosystem without disturbing its delicate balance. The silver-crested herons have established 3 additional nesting sites, reported Dr. Chen, who had become a regular visitor to the farm. "And we've documented the return of 2 amphibian species previously thought to be extirpated from this region. Your preserved wetland is becoming a remarkable recovery success story." Thomas nodded with quiet satisfaction. The land that had once seemed like an unproductive burden had transformed into both an environmental treasure and the financial salvation of his farm. The conservation easement payments provided steady income that had not only resolved his mortgage troubles, but allowed for long overdue improvements to the productive sections of his property. "Dad," Ellie called, approaching from the direction of the farmhouse, "Senator Morrison just called. The Water Resources Protection Act passed the Senate committee with bipartisan support. It's heading for a full vote next week." This was the legislation they had helped develop over the past months, a comprehensive bill that strengthened protections for watershed lands, increased transparency in property records, and provided new safeguards against the predatory acquisition strategies they had exposed. Thomas had made 3 more trips to Washington to testify as the bill was developed, his practical farmer's perspective proving invaluable in crafting provisions that would work for agricultural communities. "The senator says your testimony was pivotal," Ellie continued, her pride evident, especially the parts about how traditional farmers have been environmental stewards all along, just without the fancy terminology. Thomas smiled slightly. "Just," told them the truth. "My grandfather taught me to protect the water sources on our land long before anyone called it conservation. He understood that caring for the land meant caring for everything that makes it work." As they walked back toward the farmhouse, they passed newly installed irrigation systems, funded by a special agricultural improvement grant established for farms participating in watershed protection programs. The contrast with the financial desperation Thomas had faced 6 months earlier couldn't have been more profound. "The county assessor's office called," Ellie mentioned. With Commissioner Hayes awaiting sentencing and 3 other officials having resigned, they're conducting a comprehensive review of all property classifications. They've found 17 more properties with improperly removed environmental designations. "Any of them facing foreclosure?" Thomas asked, his concern immediate for fellow farmers who might be in the situation he had narrowly escaped. 4 were in early stages of foreclosure proceedings, all now suspended pending investigation, Ellie confirmed. "The task force is reviewing their cases specifically for evidence of the same acceleration tactics used against us." When they reached the farmhouse, they found an unexpected visitor waiting on the porch. Robert Wilson, the publisher of Agricultural Heritage, a national magazine focused on family farming. The publication had featured Thomas's story in a cover article that had resonated deeply throughout rural America, connecting his experience to similar pressures facing family farms nationwide. "Mr. Randall," Wilson greeted him enthusiastically. "Thank you for agreeing to this follow-up interview. Your story has generated the strongest reader response in our publication's history. Farmers across the country see their own struggles reflected in what you experienced." As they settled on the porch with coffee, Wilson explained the purpose of his visit. "We're preparing a special issue on water rights and family farm preservation. Your case has become the touchstone for a national conversation about who will control agricultural water resources in an era of increasing scarcity." The interview covered familiar ground: the auction confrontation, the discovery of the environmental fraud, the congressional testimony. But Wilson's questions increasingly focused on the future. "You've become the reluctant face of what many are calling a rural revitalization movement," Wilson noted. "Beyond your own farm, what do you hope will come from all of this attention?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "I'm still just a farmer who wanted to keep his family's land. But what I've learned through this experience is that the challenges facing agricultural communities aren't isolated or accidental. There are powerful interests systematically working to transfer resources, especially water rights, away from family farms and rural communities." He gestured toward the conservation preserve, visible in the distance. "The irony is that farmers have been the primary stewards of these resources for generations. If we lose family farms, we don't just lose food production, we lose the people who understand these ecosystems through daily experience and have the greatest interest in preserving them for future generations." After the interview concluded, Thomas received another visitor, Patricia Callahan, who had become a regular presence at the farm since the investigation began. She carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I found something else while organizing Milton's papers," she explained. carefully unwrapping a leather-bound journal with faded handwriting. This appears to be notes from his grandfather, who was also a county judge in the 1930s. He documented the original watershed surveys, from when this region was first mapped for agricultural development. Thomas carefully turned the brittle pages, finding hand-drawn maps that closely matched the current boundaries of his property, including specific notations about the northern wetland section. Judge Callahan wasn't just working from recent surveys. He was comparing them to historical records that showed how the watershed had been documented for nearly a century. Milton came from a family that believed in preserving knowledge, Patricia said softly. He often said that justice depends on remembering the truth, especially when others find it convenient to forget. The historical documentation would prove invaluable in the continuing legal proceedings against Meridian Global and its affiliates. The corporation had mounted an aggressive defense, claiming they had relied on county records in good faith without knowledge of the environmental misclassifications. The existence of historical surveys dating back decades would definitively disprove these claims by establishing the long-standing nature of the protections that had been deliberately removed. That evening, Thomas hosted a gathering that would have seemed unimaginable 6 months earlier, a strategy session for the newly formed Watershed Stewardship Alliance, bringing together farmers, environmental specialists, legal experts, and community advocates from across the state. The organization had emerged directly from Thomas's case, creating a coalition that bridged traditional divides between agricultural interests and environmental protection. The key insight from the Randall case, explained Dr. Jenkins, the water rights specialist who had testified alongside Thomas in Washington, is that family farmers and environmental advocates share core interests in preventing resource monopolization. When corporations control water access, both agricultural communities and ecosystems suffer. The Alliance was developing proactive strategies for identifying vulnerable watersheds, supporting farmers facing suspicious foreclosure attempts, and advocating for policies that recognized agricultural stewardship as environmental conservation. Most importantly, it provided farmers with legal resources to challenge predatory acquisition tactics, resources that Thomas had lacked until Senator Morrison's timely intervention. 6 months ago, I was hours away from losing everything. Thomas addressed the group assembled in his barn, which had been converted into a meeting space. Now we're building a network that can prevent that from happening to others. That's the unexpected legacy of what began as a desperate last stand. What Thomas couldn't fully appreciate, as he looked around at the diverse coalition that had formed around his kitchen table, was how profoundly his case had already altered the landscape of rural advocacy. By connecting agricultural preservation directly to environmental protection and community water security, the movement sparked by his stand had created a powerful new alignment of interests that transcended traditional political divisions. The humble farmer who had been blocked from bidding on his own land had inadvertently catalyzed a fundamental shift in how rural communities defended their resources against outside acquisition. Across the country, farmers were examining property records, forming local watershed alliances, and developing legal strategies based directly on the precedents established through Thomas's case. In state legislatures and county commissions nationwide, officials were reviewing water rights regulations with new awareness of the sophisticated strategies being used to circumvent existing protections. Banks were facing increased scrutiny over foreclosure practices targeting properties with water resources. Environmental agencies were updating watershed maps and strengthening protections for critical habitats. And at the center of this transformative movement stood Thomas Randall, still focused primarily on tending his fields, preserving his wetlands, and ensuring that the farm his great-grandfather had established would remain in the family for generations to come. His personal victory had evolved into something far more significant. a model for how rural communities could reclaim control of their environmental and economic destiny in the face of powerful outside interests. As the meeting concluded and participants departed into the evening, Thomas walked out to the edge of the conservation preserve, listening to the chorus of frogs and watching for the distinctive silhouettes of the silver-crested herons returning to their nests. The land that had nearly been lost to bulldozers and development was now thriving with renewed vitality, much like the movement that had grown from his unexpected stand against forces that had seemed impossibly powerful just months before. 1 year to the day after Thomas Randall was blocked from bidding at his own farm's auction, he stood before a crowd gathered on his property for the official dedication of the Callahan Conservation Center. The modest educational facility, built at the edge of the protected wetlands, would serve as both a research station for environmental scientists and a learning space where local schoolchildren could discover the importance of watershed preservation. We gather today not just to commemorate a building, but to recognize a turning point, Senator Morrison addressed the assembled guests. What began in a courthouse confrontation has blossomed into a national movement to protect our most precious resources, our water, our land, and our agricultural heritage. The audience included faces that reflected how broadly Thomas's case had resonated. Farmers from across the country who had faced similar threats, environmental advocates who had found new allies in agricultural communities, state and federal, officials involved in strengthening protective regulations, and most poignantly, families from throughout the county whose water security had been unknowingly at risk. 1 year ago, I was hours away from losing my family's farm. Thomas began his remarks, his voice steady despite his discomfort with public speaking. I didn't know then that the land I struggled to farm, what we always called the marsh, held the key not just to saving our property, but to exposing a conspiracy that threatened communities far beyond our county lines. As Thomas spoke, an aide to Attorney General Brennan quietly approached the podium, passing him a sealed envelope with an urgent whisper. The Attorney General excused himself, stepping aside to review the contents while Thomas continued his address. The true heroes of this story aren't standing on this stage, Thomas continued, gesturing toward Patricia Callahan in the front row. Judge Milton Callahan's commitment to justice even in his final days, his wife Patricia's courage in bringing his findings forward, and Senator Morrison's willingness to trust the evidence and intervene. These actions made all the difference. When it seemed no one would listen, when Thomas concluded his remarks, the Attorney General returned to the stage, his expression suggesting news of significance. After a brief consultation with Senator Morrison, they invited Thomas and Ellie to join them in the newly completed center's conference room, along with Patricia Callahan and several key investigators. We've just received confirmation of something we've suspected for months, Brennan explained once the door was closed. The forensic financial investigation has uncovered definitive evidence that Meridian Global's water acquisition strategy wasn't simply a corporate initiative. It was directly connected to a sovereign wealth fund from a water-stressed nation seeking to secure resources in drought-resistant regions of the United States. He spread documents across the conference table, banking records, investment, portfolios, and communication transcripts that painted a disturbing picture. What appeared to be a multinational corporation's aggressive business strategy was actually a foreign government's resource security operation, using multiple shell companies and investment vehicles to conceal the true origin of the capital. You're saying a foreign government was trying to control our water resources? Thomas asked, struggling to grasp the implications. Precisely, Senator Morrison confirmed. As climate change intensifies global water scarcity, several nations have begun treating water security as a national security issue, including securing resources beyond their borders. Our intelligence agencies have identified similar patterns in agricultural regions across multiple countries. This isn't just about profit, added Brennan. It's about control of an increasingly scarce resource that has no substitute. By acquiring key watershed properties in regions projected to maintain stable water supplies despite climate disruption, they were positioning for long-term strategic advantage. Patricia Callahan opened Judge Callahan's journal, turning to a passage they hadn't previously focused on. Milton noted something that seemed odd at the time, that the foreclosures targeted properties forming a complete hydrological system. He wasn't just concerned about individual wetlands, but the pattern of acquisitions that would allow complete control of water flow throughout the region. The revelation cast the entire case in a new light. What had begun as Thomas's personal struggle to save his family farm had unexpectedly exposed a sophisticated international operation, one that exploited vulnerabilities in local governance, banking systems, and environmental regulations to gain control of critical resources. "There's more," Brennan continued, his expression grave. "The medical examiner has completed the reinvestigation into Judge Callahan's death. While they cannot definitively rule out natural causes due to his documented heart condition, they found concerning levels of a compound that can trigger cardiac events in vulnerable individuals, a compound not present in any medications he was prescribed." Patricia's hand trembled as she touched her late husband's journal. Milton always said that when powerful interests feel threatened, the truth becomes dangerous. I never wanted to believe someone would. "We may never know with absolute certainty," Senator Morrison said gently, "but it reinforces how significant his discoveries were and how much was at stake for those involved." As they processed these disturbing revelations, Ellie raised the practical question that had immediate implications. What does this mean for the legislation and protections we've been developing? Does this change the approach? "It elevates everything to a matter of national security," Brennan replied. "Water resource protection is no longer just an environmental or agricultural issue. It's now recognized as critical infrastructure, requiring heightened protections against foreign acquisition and control." The meeting continued as they discussed the implications, with Thomas listening more than speaking. The farmer who had once worried only about crop yields and mortgage payments was now at the center of a national security briefing, a transformation so profound it seemed almost unreal. When they rejoined the dedication ceremony, the speakers maintained their planned remarks, withholding the new information until it could be properly addressed through appropriate channels. But Thomas moved through the remainder of the event with a new perspective on the significance of what had begun in that county courthouse a year earlier. Later that evening, as the last guests departed, Thomas walked alone to the edge of the conservation preserve. The wetland that had once seemed worthless now represented something far beyond its ecological value or the financial security it provided through conservation payments. It had become a symbol of resistance against forces that would exploit essential resources for control and profit, forces that operated in shadows until someone like Judge Callahan had the courage to bring them into the light. 2 days later, Thomas found himself once again in Washington, this time in a secure briefing room, with officials from national security agencies, water resource specialists, and agricultural policy experts. The evidence connecting Meridian Global to foreign government operations had accelerated policy development across multiple departments, with Thomas's experience providing the concrete example that made abstract threats tangible. "Mr. Randall," began the National Security Advisor, "your case has become the catalyst for a fundamental reassessment of how we protect critical resources from foreign control. The Water Resources Protection Act has been expanded to include provisions specifically addressing national security concerns in agricultural watersheds." The legislation, now fast-tracked through Congress with bipartisan support, included unprecedented protections for water resources on agricultural lands, limitations on foreign investment in properties with significant watershed features, and support programs for family farms that maintained critical hydrological systems. We've identified 37 counties across 12 states with acquisition patterns similar to what occurred in Westridge County, explained a senior intelligence analyst. In each case, properties forming complete watershed systems were being systematically targeted through different front companies, but ultimately tracing back to the same sources. For Thomas, the most meaningful aspect of these high-level discussions wasn't the national security implications, but the recognition of family farmers as essential guardians of critical resources. Policies being developed included substantial support for agricultural operations that maintained watersheds, creating economic incentives that aligned environmental stewardship with farm viability. The fundamental realization, noted the Agricultural Secretary during one session, is that family farms aren't just food producers. They're the distributed stewards of our most essential resources. When we lose a family farm to development or corporate acquisition, we lose more than agricultural capacity. We lose the generational knowledge and commitment that ensure responsible management of these critical systems. When Thomas returned home, he found the Watershed Stewardship Alliance had expanded to include chapters in 23 states, creating a network that could identify suspicious acquisition patterns and support farmers facing pressure from entities seeking to control water resources. The model developed from his experience had become a template for community action nationwide. "Your case changed everything," explained Frank Martinez, the California citrus farmer Thomas had met at the congressional hearings. Now serving as regional coordinator for the Alliance, Martinez had helped dozens of farmers identify and challenge suspicious foreclosure attempts. Before Westridge County, we were all fighting isolated battles without understanding the pattern. Now we recognize the warning signs and have the legal resources to protect our communities. What Thomas Randall could never have imagined that morning at the courthouse auction, blocked from bidding on his own property and facing the loss of his family's legacy, was how his desperate stand would ultimately transform rural America's relationship with its land and water. The humble farmer who had simply wanted to save his home had inadvertently exposed a sophisticated international conspiracy and catalyzed a movement that bridged traditional divides between agricultural communities and environmental protections. Thomas stood at the edge of his property, watching the silver-crested herons return to their nests in the now protected wetland. He reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past year. The land that 4 generations of his family had stewarded had nearly been lost, only to become the centerpiece of a national awakening about the value of family farms, not just as food producers, but as guardians of the resources upon which all communities depend. The farm that had faced foreclosure was now secure not just for his lifetime, but for generations to come. Protected by new legislation, supported through conservation programs, and recognized for its critical role in the watershed system. But more importantly, the principles established through his case were now protecting countless other family farms and water resources across the nation. What had begun with a state senator's motorcade arriving at a county auction had culminated in a fundamental shift in how America valued and protected its most essential resources, a transformation that would ensure that the stewardship Thomas had learned from his father and his father before him would continue long after his time on the land was done. 18 months after the halted auction, Thomas Randall stood at the window of a State Department conference room overlooking the National Mall in Washington, D.C. The view of the monuments and federal buildings reinforced how far his journey had taken him from the struggling family. farm, where this all began. Mr. Randall called a diplomatic aide. "They're ready for you now." Thomas straightened his tie, still uncomfortable in formal attire despite the numerous official meetings he'd attended over the past year, and followed the aide into a secure briefing room where an extraordinary gathering awaited him. Around the polished table sat representatives from the State Department, National Security Council, several federal agencies concerned with water resources, and most surprisingly, diplomatic officials from 3 countries identified as being targeted by the same water acquisition strategy exposed in Westridge County. "Thank you for coming to Washington again," greeted Secretary of State Alexandra Mitchell. "Your first-hand experience provides crucial context for today's discussions." Thomas took his assigned seat beside Ellie, who had taken a formal position with the Justice Department's Environmental Resources Division, using her legal training to help develop protections against the exploitation strategies they had uncovered. Senator Morrison sat across from them, now chairing a special committee on resource security and rural preservation that had emerged directly from their case. "As you've been briefed," the secretary continued, addressing the room, "we've confirmed coordinated attempts to acquire control of critical watersheds across multiple nations, all tracing back to the Sovereign Wealth Fund identified in the Westridge County investigation. What began with Mr. Randall's farm has revealed a global strategy to control water resources in climate-resilient regions. The evidence was presented methodically: financial records, property acquisitions, and shell company structures revealing identical patterns in agricultural regions across North America, parts of Europe, and Australia. In each case, the strategy targeted family farms in financial distress, manipulated environmental classifications, and exploited weaknesses in local governance. The implications extend beyond resource control, explained National Security Advisor Richard Bennett. By positioning to control water access in food-producing regions, these operations could potentially influence global agricultural markets and food security, creating leverage that transcends typical economic concerns. Thomas listened as officials from Canada, Australia, and Spain described discovering similar patterns within their borders. Each investigation accelerated after. Thomas's case provided the template for identifying suspicious acquisition patterns. What had seemed like isolated incidents of agricultural distress were now recognized as components of a coordinated international strategy. "The question before us," Secretary Mitchell continued, "is how to respond diplomatically while protecting vulnerable resources and agricultural communities. The nation behind these operations is an important trading partner with significant global influence." For Thomas, the geopolitical complexities were far removed from his daily reality of crop rotations and equipment maintenance. Yet his perspective had been deemed essential to these high-level discussions precisely because he represented the human impact of what might otherwise be viewed as abstract policy concerns. When invited to speak, he addressed the room with the straightforward clarity that had made his congressional testimony so compelling. "I can't speak to international diplomacy or security strategies," he began. "I'm just a farmer who almost lost everything because I didn't understand what was happening until it was almost too late. But I've learned that what looks like individual hardship, a family farm facing foreclosure, can actually be part of something much larger and more deliberate." He continued, "The most effective protection isn't just policy created in Washington or international agreements. It's empowering local communities to recognize these patterns and giving them the tools to respond before control of their resources is lost. In Westridge County, if Judge Callahan hadn't preserved those records, and if Senator Morrison hadn't arrived when she did, we wouldn't be having this conversation today, because that watershed would already be under foreign control." His practical perspective resonated with the diplomats from rural regions who recognized the same vulnerabilities in their own agricultural communities. The discussion shifted toward developing international cooperation to address these threats, without disrupting legitimate trade relationships or creating diplomatic incidents. By the end of the day, a framework had been established for a multinational working group on agricultural resource protection, a diplomatic approach that would address the water acquisition strategy without directly confronting the nation behind it, while simultaneously strengthening protections for vulnerable watersheds and family farms. As the meeting concluded, Thomas was approached by Antonio Vega, the Spanish agricultural minister, whose family maintained olive groves that had been in production for over 3 centuries. "Mr. Randall," he said, shaking Thomas's hand warmly, "your experience has helped us understand what we've been seeing in our own rural provinces. Several historic farming communities were experiencing unusual foreclosure patterns that made no sense until we applied the analysis model developed from your case. I'm glad something good has come from our struggle," Thomas replied, "though I never expected it would reach so far." Vega smiled knowingly. "Those who seek to control resources often believe farmers are simple people who won't recognize sophisticated strategies until it's too late. They forget that agriculture requires understanding complex systems and thinking across generations, skills that make farmers more perceptive than many give them credit for." That evening, Thomas joined Senator Morrison, and Attorney General Brennan for dinner at a restaurant overlooking the Potomac. The setting was far removed from his farmhouse kitchen, but the conversation focused on the practical implementation of the protections they had helped create. "The diplomatic approach is necessarily cautious," Brennan explained, "but the regulatory protections being implemented have real teeth. We've already blocked 17 attempted acquisitions that match the pattern we identified in Westridge County, and the Water Resources Protection Act amendments passed with unprecedented bipartisan support," added Senator Morrison. "Nothing unites legislators quite like preventing foreign control of American resources." Ellie, whose work now focused on helping other counties implement safeguards against similar exploitation, shared encouraging statistics. 34 counties have completed comprehensive watershed reviews using the protocols developed from our case. They've identified over 200 properties with vulnerable classifications that have been corrected before they could be exploited. As they discussed these developments, Thomas remained quiet, his thoughts returning to the farm, waiting for him back home. The international implications and policy impacts were significant, but his primary concern remained the land his family had stewarded for generations, land that now served as both productive agricultural space and protected ecological habitat. "You've been unusually quiet, Thomas," Senator Morrison observed. "Is everything all right?" He nodded thoughtfully. "Just thinking about how strange this all is. 2 years ago, I was worried about making a mortgage payment. Now, I'm sitting in Washington, discussing international water security. Sometimes I wonder what my grandfather would make of all this." "I think he'd be proud," Ellie suggested. "You're protecting not just our farm, but the principles that make family agriculture sustainable. The idea that land isn't just a commodity to be exploited for short-term profit, but a resource to be stewarded for future generations." The next morning, before returning home, Thomas was invited to a final meeting, this one at the White House with a special advisor to the President on Rural Affairs and Environmental Security, a position created partly in response to the issues exposed through Thomas's case. "Mr. Randall," the advisor began once they were seated in a small West Wing office, "the President wanted me to express personal appreciation for your contribution to understanding these critical issues. What began with your farm has fundamentally changed how we approach resource security in agricultural regions. Thomas listened as the advisor outlined a new initiative being developed, one that would formally recognize the national security value of family farms, maintaining critical watersheds, and provide comprehensive support to ensure their long-term viability. We've historically treated agriculture and environmental protection as separate or even opposing concerns, the advisor explained. Your case demonstrated how fundamentally connected they actually are, and how essential family farms are to maintaining these crucial ecological systems. What Thomas found most meaningful wasn't the high-level attention or policy impact, but the recognition that traditional agricultural stewardship, the practices his family had maintained for generations, had value that transcended crop production. The knowledge passed down through generations of farmers represented an essential perspective that sophisticated financial strategies had nearly erased. As his plane departed Washington that afternoon, Thomas gazed down at the patchwork of farms and forests below, seeing them with new awareness of how they formed interconnected systems that sustained communities far beyond their boundaries. The humble farmer who had been blocked from bidding on his own land had inadvertently revealed vulnerabilities that existed throughout the rural landscape, and in doing so had helped forge new protections that would preserve both agricultural heritage and essential resources for generations to come. What Thomas couldn't fully appreciate as his thoughts turned toward the spring planting awaiting him at home was how his straightforward integrity had provided a moral compass for policy, development that might otherwise have been guided purely by geopolitical calculations. The human story of a farmer fighting to save his heritage had transformed abstract resource concerns into a tangible narrative that resonated across political divisions, creating unprecedented consensus on issues that had previously been mired in partisan disagreement. And back in Westridge County, the Callahan Conservation Center continued to welcome visitors from across the country and around the world, all coming to understand how a humble farm had become the unlikely catalyst for a fundamental reconsideration of how nations value and protect their most essential resources. 5 years after the auction that never happened, Thomas Randall stood at the edge of his wheat field, watching his grandson, 8-year-old Michael, enthusiastically examine insects with a digital microscope, alongside Dr. Chen's research assistant. The boy's natural curiosity about the farm's ecosystem had blossomed under the guidance of the scientists who now regularly conducted research at the Callahan Conservation Center. "Grandpa, I found a wetland dragonfly nymph," Michael called excitedly, holding up the tablet displaying the magnified image. "Dr. Chen says they're bioindicators of healthy water systems." Thomas smiled, hearing terms he wouldn't have recognized 5 years ago now, flowing naturally from his grandson's vocabulary. The next generation of his family was growing up with an integrated understanding of agriculture and ecology that bridged worlds that had once seemed separate. "He has your farmer's instinct combined with his mother's scientific mind," observed Ellie, who had returned to the farm after 3 years with the Justice Department. Her experience there had proven invaluable, but her heart had pulled her back to the land, now with a vision of transforming their operation into a model of productive agriculture integrated with ecological preservation. "The college group is here," she noted, pointing toward a line of vans approaching on the farm road. The Randall farm had become a regular destination for university agricultural programs, environmental studies departments, and policy institutes, all coming to understand what had become known as the Randall model of integrated land management. What had begun as a simple conservation easement for the wetland section had evolved into a comprehensive approach that maintained productive agriculture, while enhancing ecological function throughout the property. The irrigation improvements, soil management practices, and habitat corridors they had implemented had increased both crop yields and biodiversity, demonstrating that environmental stewardship and agricultural productivity could be mutually reinforcing rather than opposing goals. Senator Morrison called this morning, Ellie mentioned, as they walked back toward the farmhouse to greet the visitors. The International Agricultural Watershed Protection Treaty has been ratified by 23 countries. She said your testimony at the UN Forum last year was repeatedly cited during the final negotiations. Thomas nodded, still somewhat uncomfortable with the international attention his story had received. His appearance at the United Nations had not been planned. He had accompanied a delegation of farmers to observe the proceedings. But when discussions became bogged down in technical details, he had been asked to speak about his personal experience. His straightforward account of nearly losing his farm to concealed water acquisition strategies had cut through diplomatic abstractions and refocused the delegates on the human impact of resource exploitation. The treaty now provided unprecedented protections for agricultural watersheds worldwide, including strict transparency requirements for land acquisitions, protections for family farms, maintaining critical water resources, and international cooperation to identify and prevent predatory acquisition strategies. As they approached the farmhouse, Thomas spotted a familiar black SUV parked beside the university vans. Attorney General Brennan had mentioned he might stop by during his visit to the region. In the 5 years since the original investigation, Brennan had become a close ally and frequent visitor to the farm, seeing in the Randall case a perfect example of how environmental protection, agricultural sustainability, and national security could align. "Thomas," Brennan called, greeting him warmly. "I've brought some people you'll want to meet." Beside him stood 2 farmers Thomas didn't recognize, a man and woman whose weathered faces and calloused hands immediately identified them as working agriculturalists rather than officials or academics. This is Miguel Santos from the Central Valley of California and Sarah Whitehorse from the Navajo Nation Agricultural Development Program. Brennan introduced them. They've implemented adaptations of your watershed management approach in their regions with remarkable results. The conversations that followed exemplified what had made the Randall case so transformative. Santos described how Central Valley farmers had organized to identify suspicious acquisition patterns targeting properties with groundwater access rights, using the analytical framework developed from Thomas's experience to block what proved to be another attempt at resource consolidation by foreign interests. "We were losing farms every month to foreclosures that didn't make economic sense," Santos explained. "After learning about Westridge County, we mapped the acquisitions and found the same pattern, targeting properties that collectively would control access to our regional aquifer. Once we recognized the strategy, we were able to challenge it legally and develop protections specifically addressing groundwater rights." Whitehorse's story reflected a different application of the same principles, using the conservation easement model developed at the Randall farm to create economic sustainability. For traditional agricultural practices that maintained critical desert water resources, our communities have managed scarce water through sophisticated practices for centuries, she explained, but there was never economic recognition of that service. The conservation framework pioneered here created a model for compensating that ecological stewardship while maintaining agricultural production, allowing our young people to see a future in continuing these traditional practices. Throughout the day, as university students toured the farm and participated in workshops at the Conservation Center, Thomas observed the ripple effects of what had begun as his personal struggle. The students moved between sections of productive cropland and preserved wetland habitat, learning how these systems functioned together rather than in opposition. a perspective that would shape how they approached resource management throughout their careers. That evening, a more intimate gathering assembled on the farmhouse porch. Thomas and Ellie, Attorney General Brennan, Patricia Callahan, and several farmers from neighboring counties who had become key figures in the regional Watershed Stewardship Alliance. The conversation reflected on how much had changed in the 5 years since the confrontation at the courthouse. "Sometimes I still can't believe how close we came to losing everything," Thomas remarked, watching the sunset paint the conservation wetlands in golden light. "If Judge Callahan hadn't preserved those records, if Maria hadn't sent that email when she did, if Senator Morrison hadn't arrived exactly when she did." "It wasn't just luck," Patricia Callahan noted softly. "Milton always said that justice depends on people recognizing the moment when standing firm becomes necessary. He saw that moment and acted, just as you did, by bringing his letter to that auction, despite having every reason to believe it was hopeless." The conversation turned to the broader impact of their stand. Commissioner Hayes had completed his sentence for corruption, and now, ironically, worked with a non-profit focused on transparency in local government. Morgan Bishop, the developer who had fronted for Meridian Global, had cooperated extensively with investigators and provided crucial evidence that had helped trace the financial networks to their sources, and the county itself had become a model of transparent resource management with comprehensive protections for its watershed lands. Most significantly, the foreign government behind the water acquisition strategy had been forced to abandon that approach in the face of international attention and new protective regulations. While diplomatic necessity had prevented public confrontation, the policy response had effectively closed the vulnerabilities their strategy had exploited. "The most important outcome isn't the policy or even the treaty," Brennan observed. "It's the awareness that has spread through agricultural communities. Farmers who might once have seen foreclosure as a personal failure now recognize when they're being strategically targeted and have resources to fight back." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "My grandfather always said a farmer needs to understand systems, how soil, water, plants, and seasons work together. He didn't use terms like ecology or watershed management, but he knew the principles. We almost lost that generational knowledge when family farms started disappearing. Now we're recognizing its value again." As darkness fell and the visitors departed, Thomas walked once more to the edge of the conservation wetlands. The chorus of frogs and night insects created a symphony that had become more diverse and vibrant each year as the protected ecosystem flourished. In the distance, the lights of the conservation center glowed softly, where a university research team was conducting overnight monitoring of nocturnal species. The land that had nearly been lost to bulldozers and development now served multiple functions that would have seemed incomprehensible 5 years earlier: productive agriculture, environmental preservation, educational resource, and research site. Most importantly, it remained what it had been for 4 generations. The Randall family farm, now secure not just for Thomas's lifetime, but for Michael's future and beyond. The mortgage that had once threatened everything had been fully satisfied 3 years earlier. The conservation easement payments, combined with premium pricing for crops grown under certified sustainable practices, had transformed the farm's finances from desperate struggle to comfortable stability. What had seemed like economic disaster, this troublesome marsh that couldn't be farmed, had proven to be the farm's greatest economic and ecological asset. As Thomas headed back toward the farmhouse where Ellie and young Michael waited, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with that desperate morning at the courthouse. The humble farmer who had been blocked from bidding on his own land had never sought to become a catalyst for international treaty negotiations or policy transformations. He had simply stood firm when necessary, guided by the same principles of stewardship that had directed his family's care for the land across generations. And perhaps that was the most important lesson from all that had transpired. That ordinary people holding fast to fundamental principles of fairness and responsible stewardship could still alter the course of events, even when facing seemingly insurmountable forces of wealth and power. Just as the silver-crested herons had returned to the wetlands, once given proper protection, the values of community resilience and resource stewardship were taking root once more across rural America and beyond, ensuring that the connection between people and the land that sustained them would endure for generations to come. 10 years to the day after Thomas Randall was blocked from bidding at his farm's foreclosure auction, the Westridge County Courthouse hosted a very different kind of gathering. The Grand Hall, once the site of that pivotal confrontation, was now filled with representatives from agricultural communities across the nation, environmental organizations, policy institutes, and government officials from local to federal levels, all assembled for the inaugural National Agricultural Watershed Conference. Thomas, now approaching 70, stood at the back of the room, uncomfortable with the attention, but deeply moved by what this gathering represented. The decade since that desperate morning had transformed not just his farm, but rural resource management throughout the country. "Dad, they're ready for you." Ellie touched his arm gently. Now in her late 30s, she had become a respected figure in sustainable agriculture policy while maintaining her role in the family farm operations. Thomas nodded and followed her toward the stage where Senator Morrison, now in her final term and widely respected as the foremost legislative champion for rural resource protection, waited to introduce him. Beside her stood Patricia Callahan, whose dignified presence remained a powerful reminder of how her late husband's commitment to justice had set these events in motion. "It is my great honor," Senator Morrison began, "to introduce someone who never sought the spotlight, but whose courage and perseverance changed how we understand the relationship between agriculture, ecology, and national security." Thomas Randall's story begins in this very courthouse, where 10 years ago today he arrived expecting to lose his family's heritage and instead sparked a movement that has transformed rural America. As Thomas approached the podium, he glanced at the audience, filled with faces that reflected the extraordinary scope of what had grown from his personal struggle. Farmers who had successfully used the protections developed from his case. Scientists whose research at the Callahan Conservation Center had advanced understanding of integrated land management. Officials who had implemented watershed protection strategies modeled on the Westridge County approach. And most meaningfully, families whose agricultural heritage had been preserved through the systems his case had helped create. "I'm still just a farmer," Thomas began, the phrase that had become his customary opening at such events. 10 years ago, I stood in this building with nothing but a letter from a deceased judge and the desperate hope of delaying what seemed inevitable. The loss of land my family had tended for generations." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "What happened instead has been recounted many times, but today I want to speak about what we've learned over these 10 years, how a crisis revealed connections we had forgotten and values we must never lose again." Thomas spoke without prepared notes, his authenticity more compelling than any polished presentation. He described the decade of transformation, how the Randall farm had become a living laboratory for integrated land management, how the wetlands, once considered worthless, had become the foundation of both ecological health and economic stability, and how the principles of stewardship that had guided his family for generations had proven remarkably aligned with the most advanced scientific understanding of sustainable resource management. "What nearly destroyed us, that troublesome marsh we couldn't farm, became our greatest asset once we understood its true value," he explained. "That's the pattern we've seen repeated across rural America as we've reconnected agricultural production with ecological function, and recognize the essential services family farms provide beyond food production. As Thomas concluded his remarks, a special presentation highlighted the decade's achievements. The Water Resources Protection Act had been strengthened through 3 subsequent amendments, each expanding protections for agricultural watersheds. The international treaty that had grown from his case now included 41 nations and had effectively curtailed predatory water rights acquisition worldwide. The Watershed Stewardship Alliance had established chapters in every state, creating a nationwide network of agricultural communities empowered to protect their resources. But the most meaningful impact was visible in the agricultural statistics. Displayed on screens throughout the hall, the dramatic reversal in family farm loss rates, with thousands of operations that might otherwise have been lost to foreclosure and development now thriving under new economic models that recognized their watershed stewardship value. The generational transfer of agricultural knowledge, which had been threatened by economic pressures forcing young people away from farming, was now supported through programs that specifically valued the integration of traditional practices with ecological management. Following the formal proceedings, the conference participants moved to the Randall farm for the dedication of an expanded Callahan Conservation Center. The modest educational facility established 5 years earlier had grown into a comprehensive research campus, where scientists, agricultural specialists, and policy experts collaborated to advance integrated land management approaches. Thomas watched with quiet satisfaction as his grandson Michael, now 13, confidently led a group of visiting officials through the wetland observation area, explaining the complex ecological relationships with the precision of a trained naturalist, combined with the practical knowledge of a farmer's grandson. The next generation was growing up with an integrated understanding that bridged worlds that had once seemed separate: science and traditional knowledge, production and conservation, economic value and ecological function. At the dedication ceremony, Attorney General Brennan, now retired, but still actively involved in resource protection advocacy, unveiled a permanent installation documenting the case that had begun in the county courthouse a decade earlier. The exhibition traced the journey, from Thomas's personal struggle to the international treaty negotiations, illustrating how a single stand against injustice had catalyzed systemic change. The lasting lesson of the Randall case isn't about policy or even environmental protection, Brennan observed in his remarks. It's about the power of ordinary people standing firm when necessary, guided by principles of stewardship and fairness that transcend politics and geography. Thomas never set out to change international water rights policy. He simply refused to surrender his family's heritage without a fight. As evening approached and the visitors departed, Thomas found himself walking the farm's boundaries with Miguel Santos and Sarah Whitehorse, the California and Navajo Nation farmers who had adapted his approach to their regions. Over the years, they had become not just colleagues in the watershed movement, but personal friends, regularly consulting on new approaches to integrated land management. "My son has taken over most of our operation now," Santos shared as they paused at the edge of the conservation wetlands. "He's implementing regenerative practices that my grandfather would recognize from our family's traditional methods, but now they're supported by conservation payments rather than undermined by economic pressure. That's the true revolution of the past decade, aligning economic incentives with generational stewardship." Whitehorse nodded in agreement. "In my community, young people who once saw no future in traditional agriculture are returning to the land. They're combining ancestral knowledge with new scientific understanding and finding economic viability through programs that recognize the value of watershed stewardship." As darkness fell, Thomas returned to the farmhouse porch where Patricia, Callahan waited, a regular visitor who had become like family over the years. At 82, she remained sharp and engaged, still serving on the Conservation Center's advisory board and ensuring her husband's legacy continued to inspire new generations. Milton would be so proud of all this, she observed, gesturing toward the lights of the research campus visible in the distance. Not just the policy changes or international treaties, but seeing a family farm thriving and growing into something that serves the larger community while remaining true to its heritage. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. I often think about how close we came to losing it all. If you hadn't brought those documents forward exactly when you did. Perhaps it was meant to be, Patricia suggested. Milton believed that justice finds its moment if people remain vigilant. Your farm became that moment, the catalyst that helped us recognize what we were in danger of losing before it was too late. As they sat in comfortable silence, watching the fireflies emerge over the conservation wetlands, Thomas reflected on the decade's journey. The mortgage that had once threatened everything was long since satisfied. The farm that had faced foreclosure had evolved into a multifaceted operation, combining traditional agriculture with ecological stewardship, research partnerships, and educational programs. The troublesome marsh that couldn't be farmed had become the centerpiece of an approach to land management, now being implemented across multiple continents. Most importantly, the knowledge and connection to the land that 4 generations of Randalls had cultivated was now secure for Michael's generation and beyond. The continuity that had nearly been broken, the understanding of how to work with natural systems rather than against them, how to balance production with preservation, how to think across generations rather than quarterly profits, had not only been preserved, but had become recognized as essential wisdom for addressing the complex challenges of a changing climate and growing resource pressures. The humble farmer, who had been blocked from bidding on his own land, had never sought to become a symbol or catalyst for change. He had simply stood firm when necessary, guided by the same principles of stewardship that had directed his family's care for the land across generations. In doing so, he had helped reconnect communities with values and wisdom that offered a path forward amid unprecedented challenges, demonstrating that the most powerful solutions often emerge not from complex technologies or political strategies, but from remembering fundamental truths about our relationship with the land that sustains us. As Thomas looked toward the future, his grandson's generation and beyond, he felt a deep sense of completion. The cycle that had nearly been broken had instead been renewed and strengthened. The land would continue to be cared for by people who understood its true value, and the knowledge accumulated through generations of stewardship would continue to evolve and adapt to new challenges. What had begun as one farmer's desperate last stand had come full circle, transforming not just a single property, but how communities across rural America and beyond understood and valued their essential connection to the land and water that sustained them. And perhaps that was the most meaningful legacy of all, the recognition that in an era of increasing complexity and global challenges, the wisdom of those who work closely with the land remains an irreplaceable guide to creating a future that honors both human needs and the natural systems upon which all life depends. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.